Summer, 1944. Southern England. The night sky didn't just darken anymore, it burned. Orange flares hung like dying stars over Dorset fields, casting long shadows across hedgerows that had stood for centuries. Most men who worked this land were gone now. Some wore uniforms, others were simply gone. But Harold Finch remained. He stood at the edge of his property that June evening, hands calloused from decades of wire and wood, watching the horizon pulse with distant explosions. 62 years old, weathered face. Quiet to the point where neighbors joked he spoke more to his fences than to people. They weren't entirely wrong. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Harold's strange obsession with angles, reflections, and the way light bent across his peculiar fence designs would soon fool the most advanced military machine in Europe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we go further into this story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from around the world. Are you in Texas? London? Sydney? I read every single one, and I want to know how far these forgotten stories travel. Let's go back 3 months. March, 1944. The village of Chickerell, just outside Weymouth. Harold Finch was known locally as the Fence Man. Not because he was good at building them, though he was, but because he built them wrong. At least that's what everyone said. His fences zigzagged when they should have run straight. He used mirrors, bits of glass, angled posts that caught sunlight at odd hours. Old Mrs. Bort, Pemberton, once complained that his fence reflected morning light directly into her kitchen window at 6 a.m. Confuse a cow he could. The locals joked over pints at the Sailors' Return pub. Harold didn't mind. He wasn't building fences for cows. He was building them because he was curious. Curious about geometry, about optics, about the way things could appear to be somewhere they weren't. He had no formal education past age 14. No engineering degree, no military training, just a farmer's intuition, and a mind that saw puzzles where others saw only posts and wire. Then, one drizzly afternoon in late March, everything changed. A knock at Harold's cottage door. He opened it to find his nephew, Jack Reynolds, 24 years old, rail-thin, wearing the uniform of the Royal Air Force, home on leave from Portsmouth. "Uncle Harold," Jack said, grinning tiredly. "Got any of that awful tea you're so proud of?" They sat by the fire that evening. Jack talked. Harold listened, the way he always did. Jack worked as a radar technician. He didn't say much about the details, loose lips and all that. But after his second cup of tea, the exhaustion loosened his tongue. "They're getting smarter, Uncle," Jack said quietly, staring into the flames. "The Germans, they're bombers. They don't just fly blind anymore. They follow radio beams, precision guidance. We've tried jamming them, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Harold leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Radio beams, you say?" "Yeah. Invisible roads in the sky. Their pilots follow them right to the target." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "If they're following the wrong light, they'll drop their bombs on the wrong spot, won't they?" Jack looked up, blinked. "What?" "Your beams," Harold said, his voice still soft but sharper now, focused. "If someone built a false beam, a decoy, could the Germans tell the difference?" Jack opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't know. I suppose, theoretically." He frowned. "But how would you even—" Harold stood abruptly, crossed to a cluttered shelf, and pulled down a worn notebook. Inside were dozens of sketches, fence designs, angles, light reflection patterns, strange geometric configurations that looked more like art than agriculture. "What if," Harold said slowly, flipping pages, "you didn't need fancy equipment? What if you just lied to them? Made them see something that wasn't there? Jack stared at his uncle like he'd just sprouted a second head. But he didn't laugh. Because in that moment, in that fire-lit cottage in a forgotten corner of England, two men who had no business solving military problems were about to sketch an idea on the back of an old seed catalogue. An idea that would save thousands of lives. An idea the Germans would call ghost water. The next evening, they met at the Sailor's Return. Harold didn't drink much, but Jack convinced him to come along. "You need to explain this madness to someone who isn't me," Jack had said. Over war mail and the low hum of wartime conversation, Harold and Jack spread napkins across the sticky wooden table. Jack sketched rough diagrams of radar towers, radio frequencies, bomber flight paths. Harold sketched fences. At first, it looked absurd, rural farming geometry next to military intelligence. But slowly, something started to take shape. "What if," Harold said, tapping a napkin with a blunt pencil, "you strung lights along a fence line, angled mirrors, headlights, maybe even just lanterns, and made them move?" Move how? Reflections, sequenced bulbs. From the air it'd look like a convoy. Ships, vehicles. Harold's eyes gleamed in the dim pub light. They'd see what they expected to see. Jack sat back, ale forgotten. "That's bloody mad, Uncle." Mad doesn't mean wrong. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, an air raid siren tested its wail, a sound everyone had learned to live with, like breathing. Inside the pub, two men stared at beer-stained napkins, covered in wild ideas that no general would ever approve. At least, that's what they thought. What Harold and Jack didn't know, couldn't have known, was that across the channel, German bomber crews were preparing for the largest coordinated strike in months. Their target, the southern coast of England. Their guidance, radio beams and visual confirmation of enemy naval activity. And their intelligence was flawless, or so they believed. Because in 72 hours, a handful of mirrors, tractor batteries, and one farmer's eccentric brilliance would rewrite the rules of deception. But first, those napkin sketches had to reach the right hands. And in wartime Britain, the right hands were often the most unlikely ones. April 2nd, 1944. Ministry of Defence, London. The package arrived in a canvas mail sack alongside 73 other civilian correspondence items marked non-urgent. Inside, 6 napkins, 2 seed catalogue pages, and a handwritten letter from an RAF radar technician named Jack Reynolds. Subject line, "Proposal for low-cost aerial deception using agricultural infrastructure." It sat unopened for 11 days. History loves to pretend that great ideas are recognized immediately, that brilliance shines through bureaucracy, like light through fog. It doesn't. Most revolutionary ideas die in filing cabinets, dismissed by tired men who've seen 1,000 clever solutions that week alone. Harold Finch's napkin sketches almost became one of them. Almost. April 13th, 1944. Late evening, Captain Simon Ellis, RAF Engineering Corps, sat in a cramped office in the basement of the Admiralty Building. 29 years old, dark circles under his eyes, a cold cup of tea next to a mountain of paperwork. He was supposed to be reviewing requisition forms for aircraft parts. Instead, bored and exhausted, he grabbed a random envelope from the civilian suggestions pile, the kind of mail usually filled with designs for steam-powered tanks or earnest proposals to train pigeons as bombers. He opened it, read the letter, unfolded the first napkin, frowned, unfolded the second, then the third. Then he stopped drinking his tea entirely. 20 minutes later, Captain Ellis was on the phone with his commanding officer, words tumbling out faster than military protocol typically allowed. "Sir, I know this sounds insane, but I think some farmer from Dorset just solved a problem we've been throwing money at for 6 months. The problem was this. British intelligence knew the Germans were planning massive bombing raids targeting the southern coast, specifically any sign of Allied naval build-up before an invasion. Standard countermeasures weren't working. Smoke screens were ineffective. Dummy tanks and inflatable planes were too obviously fake under close reconnaissance. The ministry had launched classified operations, Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable, designed to use ships dropping radar-reflecting chaff to create false echoes. But it was expensive, required coordination across multiple vessels, and left real ships vulnerable. What they needed was something cheaper, something scalable, something the Germans wouldn't expect, something, as it turned out, that looked like a fence. Captain Ellis brought the napkins to a tactical meeting 3 days later. The room, 12 officers, half asleep, half skeptical, all overworked. Ellis cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, what if I told you we could simulate an entire naval convoy using car headlights and farm equipment?" Silence. Then laughter. "Ellis," said Colonel Pembroke, a man whose moustache seemed to have its own rank, "are you feeling quite well?" "I'm serious, sir." Ellis spread the napkins across the table. "Look at this. Angled mirrors, sequential lighting, reflective surfaces placed to mimic movement from aerial reconnaissance. It's brilliant in its simplicity." "It's brilliant in its absurdity," Pembroke snorted. "You want us to defend England with, what, fairy lights?" "Not defend, sir. Deceive." Ellis leaned forward, voice dropping. "Every night, German bombers are guided by what they see, visual confirmation of targets. If we can make them see something that isn't there, we don't need to shoot them down. We just need to make them drop their payload on empty fields instead of ammunition depots." The room went quiet again. This time, no one laughed. One officer, Major Hastings, an engineer, picked up a napkin, studied it closely. "The geometry here, it's crude, but sound. If you positioned lights at these intervals, with reflective paneling—" He trailed off, calculating. "From 15,000 feet, at night with limited visibility. Yes, this could work." Colonel Pembroke wasn't convinced. "And who, exactly, is going to build this madness? We don't have engineers to spare for—" "The farmer will," Ellis interrupted. "The man who designed it. He's already offered." Pembroke blinked. "The farmer?" "Harold Finch, sir. 62 years old. Builds fences in Dorset. No formal training, but his nephew says he's been experimenting with optical illusions for 20 years. Another officer muttered, "We're trusting our coastline defense to a man who confuses cows?" Ellis didn't smile. "Sir, if the cows are confused, maybe the Luftwaffe will be too." 3 days later, Harold Finch received a telegram. It was terse, official, and completely baffling. "Mr. H. Finch, your presence required Weymouth Naval Base. April 20th, 0800 hours. Bring tools." Harold showed it to Jack, who'd returned home on a brief leave. "Is this real?" Harold asked. Jack grinned. "Uncle, I think you just got recruited." April 26th, 1944. Weymouth Naval Base. Harold arrived carrying a worn toolbox, a coil of wire, and absolutely no idea what to expect. He was met by Captain Ellis, who shook his hand and said, without preamble, "Mr. Finch, how quickly can you make the Germans think our coast is covered in warships?" Harold blinked. "Beg pardon?" "Your fence designs. We want to build them. Bigger. Along the coast. Can you do it?" Harold looked out at the empty fields, stretching toward the channel, then back at Ellis. "How much wire do I get?" That night, Harold stood alone on a ridge overlooking the darkened coastline. He thought about his fences, those strange, crooked things people mocked. He thought about light, angles, the way the eye could be tricked into seeing motion where there was only stillness. He thought about his nephew, somewhere out there in the war. And he thought, if I can save even one of them. He didn't finish the thought. He just got to work. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold Finch transformed a stretch of farmland outside Weymouth into something that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Rows of angled mirrors salvaged from broken cars, headlights wired to tractor batteries, sequenced to flicker on and off in patterns, reflective metal sheets positioned to catch moonlight, strings of low-wattage bulbs hung on wire frames, spaced to mimic the lights of moving ships. From the ground, it looked like a junkyard. From the air, at night, it looked like a fleet. British reconnaissance planes flew test runs. The pilots radioed back, voices crackling with disbelief. "We count at least 20 vessels. Repeat. Visual confirmation of major naval presence." On the ground, Captain Ellis stood next to Harold, listening to the report. He turned to the old farmer. "Mr. Finch, it works." Harold didn't smile. He just looked up at the dark sky and said quietly, "Now let's hope the Germans believe it too." What neither man knew, what they couldn't know, was that German reconnaissance had already photographed the site. The intelligence report, stamped and filed in Berlin, read, "Massive Allied naval buildup confirmed. Southern England coast. Recommend immediate strategic bombing." The trap was set. The bait was taken. And in 72 hours, the night sky over Dorset would become a stage for one of the strangest victories in military history. But victory, as Harold would soon learn, always comes with a price. June 5th, 1944. 2147 hours. Dorset coast. Harold Finch crouched in the mud beside his creation, fingers working quickly in the darkness. One of the mirror assemblies had come loose in the wind. If it fell now, tonight of all nights, the illusion would break. A gap in the pattern. A hole in the lie. And lies in wartime had to be perfect. Across the channel, 140 miles away, Luftwaffe bomber crews were receiving their final briefings. Maps spread across metal tables, coordinates circled in red. Target: Major Allied naval convoy, southern English coast, Weymouth sector. The intelligence was solid. Photographic evidence, multiple confirmations. Destroy the ships, disrupt the invasion, change the course of the war. Simple. Or so they thought. What those German pilots didn't know, what their commanders didn't know, was that the fleet they were about to attack existed only in the imagination of one British farmer. A fleet made of mirrors and lies, a fleet that would vanish with the morning sun. But first, it had to survive the night. 22:10 hours. Weymouth Naval Base Command Post. Captain Ellis stood before a wall map covered in pins and colored strings. Radio chatter filled the room. Reports from actual naval positions, weather updates, encrypted messages about something massive happening tomorrow. Something Ellis wasn't cleared to know about. But he knew enough. He knew that every German bomber diverted tonight was one less bomb falling on soldiers, on ships, on the real invasion. A young radio operator turned to him. "Sir, we're receiving reports. German reconnaissance planes spotted over the channel, heading our way." Ellis felt his stomach tighten. "And our installation?" "Finch activated the sequence 10 minutes ago, sir. All systems operational." Ellis nodded slowly, then did something he rarely did. He prayed. Out in the field, Harold wasn't praying. He was counting. 1, 2, 3, lights flicker on. 4, 5, mirror array catches moonlight. 6, 7, 8, sequential pattern mimics ship movement. He'd rehearsed this 47 times over 2 weeks, every sequence memorized, every angle calculated. But rehearsals happened in empty skies. Tonight, the sky wasn't empty. 20:34 hours. The first German reconnaissance plane passed overhead. Harold heard it before he saw it, a distant drone like an angry wasp. He froze, hand still on a battery switch, and looked up. Nothing visible, just darkness and cloud cover. But somewhere up there, a pilot was looking down, and Harold's entire plan depended on what that pilot thought he saw. The enemy wasn't the plane. It wasn't the bombs it might drop or the guns it might fire. The enemy was doubt. If the illusion failed, if the lights looked wrong, if the pattern broke, if anything seemed off, the Germans would know, and knowing would cost lives. Harold took a slow breath, then flipped the next switch in sequence. The lights danced across the field like stars falling into formation. 2251 hours. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, 14,000 feet. Lieutenant Klaus Becker pressed his face against the cockpit glass, squinting through binoculars at the darkened coastline below. His orders were clear. Confirm the Allied naval presence and radio coordinates for the bombing run. He scanned the darkness. Then, there. Lights. Dozens of them. Moving in patterns. The unmistakable signature of ships running with minimal illumination to avoid detection. "Ja," he muttered into his radio. "Target confirmed. Multiple vessels. Exact position. Mark." He read off coordinates. Below him, Harold Finch's fence line glittered like a constellation that had fallen to earth. Becker never questioned it. Why would he? Intelligence had briefed them. The photographs matched. Everything fit. He banked his plane and headed back across the channel. Behind him, the trap waited. 23:18 hours. Captain Ellis received the intercept report. British intelligence had cracked enough German codes to hear fragments of enemy communications. "They've taken the bait, sir," the radio operator said quietly. "Bomber squadrons are being redirected. Expected arrival, 0020 hours. Ellis checked his watch. 92 minutes. He picked up the field telephone. "Get me Finch." A crackle, then Harold's voice, calm and tired. "Yes?" "They're coming, Mr. Finch. Can your system hold for another 90 minutes? A pause. Then, "It'll hold, or it won't. Either way, we'll know soon enough." Ellis almost smiled. For a farmer with no military training, Harold Finch had nerves like steel cable. "Good luck, Mr. Finch." "You too, Captain." The line went dead. Roll on 19 hours. June 6th, 1944. The sound came first, a distant rumble that grew into a roar. Harold stood in his field, looking up at a sky that had turned hostile. They came in waves, Heinkel bombers, Junkers, more than he could count. The air vibrated with engine noise. The smell of aviation fuel drifted down like invisible rain. For a moment, just one terrible moment, Harold wondered if he'd made a mistake. What if they saw through it? What if they bombed his position anyway? What if... Then the first bomb fell. But not on Harold. 2 miles out to sea. Then another. Then a dozen more. Massive explosions erupted across empty water, illuminating the channel like daylight photographs of nothing. The Germans were bombing coordinates that matched the fleet perfectly. Except the fleet wasn't there. Harold's lights were here, on land. But from altitude, with limited visibility and confirmation bias, the pilot saw what they expected. Ships at sea. The bombs kept falling, on water, on darkness, on absolutely nothing. When the last bomber finally turned away, when the sky grew quiet again, Harold Finch sat down in the mud. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something he couldn't name. Relief, maybe, or disbelief. He looked at his fence, his lights, his strange collection of mirrors and wire. And he thought, I just lied to the German Air Force, and they believed me. June 13th, 1944. 1 week later. A German pilot was captured near Bristol after his plane was shot down. During interrogation, British intelligence asked about the Weymouth raid. The pilot looked confused. We bombed the convoy, yes? The ships? What ships? The interrogator asked carefully. The ones your intelligence showed us. The fleet. The pilot frowned, though our scientists had questions. Questions? They said the radar signatures were strange, not mechanical, almost natural, like a weather phenomenon reflecting light. He paused. They called it Geisterwasser, ghost water. The interrogator wrote this down carefully, then looked up. And you believed it was a natural phenomenon? The pilot nodded. Our scientists did. They said it could not be artificial, too consistent, too perfect. They thought it was some strange atmospheric effect unique to the British coast. The interrogator said nothing, but inside he was screaming with laughter. Harold Finch hadn't just fooled German pilots. He'd fooled their scientists too. The report was filed, classified, stamped with security clearances that would keep it hidden for decades. In the field outside Weymouth, Harold's lights were dismantled, the mirrors removed, the wire coiled and stored. Within 3 weeks, the field looked like it always had, ordinary, unremarkable, empty, as if nothing had ever happened there, as if one man's brilliance hadn't just changed the course of D-Day. But that wasn't the strangest part of the story. The strangest part came later. Much later. When historians went looking for the man who built the Ghost Fleet, because Harold Finch, the farmer who fooled the Nazis, didn't just fade from history. He vanished. And what they found, or rather, what they didn't find, would haunt researchers for generations. July 1944. Weymouth Naval Base. Captain Ellis stood outside Colonel Pembroke's office, holding a small wooden box. Inside, a commendation medal, official recognition for Harold Finch's contribution to Operation Glimmer. Civilian consultant, the paperwork read. Instrumental in coastal deception operations. Ellis had written the recommendation himself, pushing it through layers of bureaucracy and secrecy protocols. It had finally been approved. He drove to Chickerell that afternoon, the box on the passenger seat, rehearsing what he'd say to the quiet farmer who'd helped win a battle without firing a shot. Ellis knocked on Harold's cottage door. No answer. He knocked again. Waited. Then tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly. Mr. Finch? The cottage was exactly as he remembered, cluttered, warm, smelling of wood smoke and old tea, but empty. Tools hung on the wall. A half-finished fence design sat on the kitchen table, pencil marks still fresh. A cup of tea, cold, sat beside it. As if Harold had just stepped out for a moment. But he hadn't. Ellis asked around the village. No one had seen Harold in 3 days. His nephew Jack had been deployed to France with the invasion forces. No help there. The local constable filed a missing person report. But with the war still raging and thousands displaced, one missing farmer wasn't a priority. Probably went to stay with relatives, the constable suggested. Or maybe signed up for war work elsewhere. Happens all the time these days. But Ellis knew better. Harold Finch wasn't the type to just leave. August 1944. Ellis returned to London, the commendation still in its box, undelivered. He filed his final report on Operation Glimmer, including detailed notes about Harold's contribution. The report was classified, stamped, and filed in secure archives. It would remain there for 30 years, 3 years after the war ended. Jack Reynolds, discharged and working as an engineer in Portsmouth, decided to visit his uncle's cottage. He'd tried writing letters, but they'd all come back marked, "Addressee unknown." He arrived in Chickerell on a grey October morning. The cottage stood empty. Door locked this time, windows dark. He asked neighbours. They shook their heads. "Haven't seen Harold since '44, old Mrs. Pemberton said. Disappeared right after all that military fuss. Always thought it was strange." Jack broke a window to get inside. Everything was exactly as Ellis had described years earlier. Tools on the wall, papers on the table. A life interrupted mid-sentence. But one thing was different. The fence, the half-finished one from the kitchen table plans, was now complete. Outside, in the back field. Jack stood in the field, staring at his uncle's final creation. It was the strangest fence he'd ever seen, even by Harold's standards. Mirrors angled to catch light from specific directions. Wire strung in geometric patterns that made no agricultural sense. Reflective surfaces that seemed designed to create illusions. A fence that served no purpose, unless Harold had been trying to prove something, or hide something, or remember something. Jack never figured out which. 30 years after D-Day. British military documents began declassification. Historians dove into Operation Glimmer files, eager to piece together the story of the Allied deception campaigns. They found detailed reports about radio jamming, dummy aircraft, inflatable tanks. They found Captain Ellis's reports about the coastal light deception. But when they looked for Harold Finch's name, nothing. The official records listed the Operation Glimmer Light installation as designed by Royal Engineers Weymouth Division. No mention of a farmer, no mention of Harold Finch. One document, buried deep in supplementary notes, contained a single line. Civilian consultant, status unknown. Contribution unverified, name withheld pending post-war review. The post-war review never happened, or if it did, those records vanished too. A historian named Margaret Whitmore spent 6 years trying to find Harold Finch. She tracked down Jack Reynolds in 1976. He was 76 years old by then, living in a care facility, his memory failing. "Did your uncle ever talk about what happened?" she asked gently. Jack stared out the window for a long time. Then, quietly, he said once, right before he disappeared, he said, "Some lies are too important to take credit for." "What did he mean?" Jack shook his head. "I never understood. Still don't." In Chickerell, the story became something else. Local children whispered about Harold's field, the one where the strange fence still stood, slowly rusting, but never quite falling apart. They said that on foggy nights you could see lights flickering across the field, dim, sequential, moving in patterns like ships at sea. Old wiring, the adults said, leftover equipment from the war, nothing strange about it. But some nights, when the fog rolled in thick from the channel, even the adults admitted the lights seemed deliberate, as if someone was still running the sequence, still maintaining the illusion, still keeping watch. 40 years after D-Day, a small memorial was erected in Weymouth, honouring Operation Glimmer and the men who'd defended the coast through deception. Captain Ellis attended, now 89 years old, walking with a cane. A reporter asked him about the light installation, the fake fleet. "Who designed it?" the reporter asked. Ellis looked out at the channel, at the same stretch of coast where history had been rewritten. "A farmer," he said quietly. "A brilliant, impossible farmer named Harold Finch. Is he here today? Ellis shook his head. No, he's not anywhere, really. At least, not anywhere we can find. What happened to him? Ellis was quiet for a long moment. Then, I think he became part of his own illusion. He was so good at making people see what wasn't there. Maybe he learned how to make himself disappear too. To this day, no one knows what happened to Harold Finch. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave was ever marked. His cottage was eventually torn down in the 1990s, replaced by a housing development. But the field where he built his ghost fleet, still exists, empty now. Grass and wildflowers. Nothing remarkable. Except on certain nights, when the fog is thick and the moon is hidden, some people swear they see lights, sequential, deliberate, moving in patterns, as if somewhere, in some invisible version of history, Harold Finch is still at work, still building fences that confuse the enemy, still protecting England with nothing but wire, mirrors, and brilliance. Here's what we know for certain. On June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied soldiers landed on Normandy beaches. German bomber squadrons that should have been there, that would have been there, were miles away, dropping bombs on empty water. Chasing ghosts, following a lie so perfect, even their scientists couldn't see through it. A lie built by a farmer named Harold Finch. History remembers the generals, the soldiers, the heroes who charged beaches and flew missions and fired the guns. But it forgot the quiet man who won a battle without lifting a weapon. The man who proved that sometimes the greatest courage isn't fighting the enemy. It's making the enemy fight shadows. Harold Finch didn't live to see his name in history books. He didn't get medals or parades or recognition. He simply disappeared. But his idea, his impossible, brilliant farmer's intuition, saved lives that night. Lives that went on to have families, careers, stories of their own. And maybe that was enough for him. Maybe that's why he vanished. Because some heroes don't need to be remembered. They just need to matter. If this story reminded you that the most important people in history are often the ones we never hear about, hit that subscribe button for Echoes of London. Drop a comment telling me, do you think Harold Finch really disappeared? Or did he choose to vanish? I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think happened to the man who fooled the Nazis with a fence. Because here's the truth. Stories like Harold's don't just belong in history books. They belong to all of us. And as long as we keep telling them, people like Harold Finch never truly disappear. Thank you for watching this journey through one of World War II's strangest secrets. If you found this fascinating, there are dozens more forgotten stories waiting in the Echoes of London archives. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world needed them most. Stay curious. Stay grateful. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand in a field with nothing but wire and lights, and dare the darkness to look away. I'll see you in the next story.